All right. We're going to go ahead and get started. So, welcome everyone. My name is Horacio Arias Rodriguez. I am the Museum Services Coordinator here at the Zuckerman Museum of Art. Thank you for being here with us this morning and joining us for this incredible lecture that you're about to hear. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker for the day. So, Dr. Tierney Brosius is an associate professor of biology at Augustana College, where she merges her passions for science and art to foster a deeper appreciation for insects and their role in human culture. She believes art is a powerful tool for conveying scientific concepts, enhancing observational skills, and reshaping public perceptions of insects. Tierney's research focuses on urban insect diversity and the ecological dynamics influenced by urbanization and fire suppression. Her teaching emphasizes the intersection of art and science using scientific illustration and drawing activities to cultivate her students' curiosity and connection to the natural world. A significant aspect of Tierney's work lies in cultural entomology, examining the complex relationships between insects and human culture. She is particularly interested in how insects are represented in art and fashion, and how these representations can address environmental issues like habitat destruction and climate change. Tierney also creates wearable art, including beaded jewelry, embroidered accessories, and knitted garments, using insects as inspiration. These pieces serve as tools for outreach, sparking conversations and fostering an appreciation for the beauty and importance of insects. Her ultimate goal is to inspire others to see insects in a new light and recognize their critical roles in both nature and human culture. So, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I am absolutely thrilled to be here talking to you today. And really, when I put this presentation together, I kind of included a little bit about my background, what inspires me, a little bit about insects and fashion, because I think it's such an interesting story that I'm continuing to explore. And on top of that, I thought I'd share some of the projects I'm working on and some of the plans I have for the future. So, overall, so let me go ahead and just share my screen because this is a lot of images. And since I realize there's a lot of artists here, I'm sure you'll appreciate that. So, oh, okay. So today we'll be talking about crafting awareness, celebrating insects with wearable art. And as you can see, I've got a bit of a preview here. I'm so thrilled to be giving a talk in association with Jennifer Angus, who is one of my absolute most favorite people. I've gotten a chance to see a few of her exhibits, and she does have this amazing ability to build magical worlds using insects. So I guess a little bit about what makes me tick. So when I was about 4 years old, my mom had come home from an early morning walk and opened up her hands and presented me with a Cecropia moth that looked like this. It is North America's largest moth species. And it's one of those childhood memories that you just have like a visceral, like memory. I think I actually imprinted on this moth. And from that point on, insects held a really special place in my heart and have really driven a lot of what I wanted to do long term. And just to give you an idea, I grew up in the rural part of Nebraska, was really influenced by my mother and my grandmother. And I learned textile art from a young age with embroidery, knitting. And I participated in something called 4-H. It's a kind of a rural program where you take projects to the county fair. And every year I had something that was textile related. And of course, I'd bring back my insect collection every year. So both of these things have always had a big part of my life from an early age. But growing up, I became an entomologist because I was what most would consider first generation college. And, as much as I loved art, I was kind of dissuaded from maybe pursuing that path for financial reasons. It was a little frightening for my parents. I'm sure the artists in the room have heard some of those things before. But I loved both. And so I went to graduate school, studied tiger beetles as part of my PhD. Right now, I'm working with a group that's actually exploring some tiger beetles that are living along thermal pools in Yellowstone National Park. And as I tell my students, a big part of that research, the question is why aren't you dead? Because they're living in these really hostile, horrible environments and thriving. So it's been some really interesting questions coming out of that. And as was mentioned in the introduction, I spend a lot of time looking at urban insects, primarily these carabid beetles that all look black, but represent several different species, and they can tell us a lot about how the environment is changing. So lots of attention to detail, even in the science that I do. But more recently, I have started to kind of explore this concept of insects in fashion. And I guess it probably started when graduate school, where I noticed that, I started collecting t-shirts and things like that. And I noticed that people responded differently when they noticed that not only were you talking about bugs, but you were wearing them. And it's been kind of it was started out as a fun hobby to just collect articles of clothing. Then I began to make clothing, which I'll talk about today, whether it be in knitting or sewing skills that I picked up over time. Lots of fun with that. One thing I did notice as I was collecting, and oftentimes I pick up a lot of things on eBay or some sort of secondhand market because I can't afford a lot of the high-end brands, Givenchy, Gucci, and some of these other brands. Again and again, will go back and use insects as inspiration. And I began to wonder, what was it about insects? I kind of understand that insects obviously are absolutely gorgeous, but was there a special reason why fashion designers continued to look at insects as inspiration for their work? And I guess one of the moments where this really came to light was I was actually I was getting a presentation about insects and fashion together, much like this one. And I had a colleague of mine, a physics professor, swing by my office, and I happened to have these pieces on my desktop. And I'm like, aren't these just absolutely gorgeous? Which I think maybe some of you probably think they're beautiful, but apparently a normal reaction to this is something along these lines. He kind of came in and he's like, that is nightmare fuel. And the other comment that he said was, if my date showed up in that, I would run. And so sometimes I need people to remind me about what kind of I don't want to say normal, but maybe an average response to seeing a bunch of large insects crawling on your garments are. And that does, I think that's a legitimate response. And I honestly think that's a response that some of these fashion designers are looking for to some extent. The Gengim Gadi had a whole line of insects in fashion where he stated that there's a beauty in ugliness. And he talked about how he had a fear of insects as he was designing his pieces. And Alexander McQueen, which I'll talk about a bit today, had this lovely quote, get the ugliest thing on the planet, the maggot, and transform it into a Madonna. And he was really interested in this idea of pushing back against what we perceive as being beautiful. So, what we wear has cultural meaning. So I was interested in, what does it mean when we wear insect imagery? What can examining insects in fashion tell us about human values when it comes to insects? And how can we use this information to communicate about the importance of insects? And this is what I'm really interested in. Can I use some of this energy to then turn around and talk about why insects are so important? Coloration in nature has a lot of things, purposes, camouflage, mimicry, distraction, signals of warning, advertising, sexual selection. And, when it comes to humans, I feel like we kind of got the short end of things, right? We're not all that colorful. We're not that exciting, but we've taken matters into our own hands. We adorn ourselves in brightly colored garments around the world. And we also have started painting, pigmenting our own skin and even our own hair. So I don't have a ton of time here, but we know that cultural anthropology studies humans' relationships with clothing because it can tell us so much. It can tell us about social status, changes in technologies and trade, cultural and symbolic meanings. And then if we just take the scarab beetle as a really good example, right? It brings everything together. We have a winged scarab that is, over 1,000 years old from ancient Egypt. And then we see that scarab beetle getting used, in the 1880s as part of the Victorian fashion trends. This is actually a real scarab beetle, but some of their jewelry had different, used insects over and over again. And then even 100 years later, Cartier is making these beautiful brooches. And then just a few years ago, Gucci still often reaches to the scarab beetle because it has so much symbolic meaning. And I'm going to just take you through a quick little story about how insects have been so pervasive in the fashion industry with some of my favorite characters. Schiaparelli, who I think is having like a big comeback. I keep seeing Schiaparelli garments on the red carpet lately. And she was an early fashion designer who was associated with surrealism. She kind of pushed the boundaries of what was seen as proper fashion. And they kind of called her the mother of strange fashion and really saw fashion as being performative. One of my favorite stories about her is how her mother told her she wasn't very pretty and she was kind of plain. And I like the way that this demonstrates how her mind worked. You know, instead of sulking, she went and bought some flower seeds and planted them in her face, like in her eyes and her ears. And she recounts how that she imagined this beautiful garden growing from her face. Unfortunately, ended up actually just needing to see some doctors. But it kind of gives you the inner working of her mind. And we're going to revisit this idea. But her pagan collection is one of her most famous, and it has lots of insects. And they kind of saw these as her little tricks. Because even at the time, she was looking to shock audiences. She wasn't doing this necessarily. She was doing it because, one, insects are beautiful, but also they have a tendency to put people on edge. The surrealist movement was kind of known for this whimsy, unusual, to kind of think about a dream state, unleashing the imagination. And of course, when you think about surrealism, you immediately think about Salvador Dali and his melting clocks. One thing you may not initially, I didn't see it right away either, but when you look at these paintings, one thing you should notice is there are often lots of insects. A piece that came out a few years ago by Gene Kritsky, Dan Matter, and Jesse Smith actually went in and quantified the number of insects that are found in Salvador Dali's work and surveyed, and about 10% include insect imagery. He really used ants, and apparently if you read his autobiography, he talks about finding a dead bat as a small child, bringing it home. He was going to study it the next day, and he came and there's this swarm of ants, and he was absolutely disgusted, but of course fascinated by that emotion. Butterflies, moths, caterpillars. And you might think, man, he must have absolutely loved insects. Maybe not by this quote. Even today, if I were on the edge of a precipice and a large grasshopper sprang upon my face and fastened itself, I should prefer to fling myself over the edge rather than to endure the frightening thing. So, not necessarily an insect lover, but very aware of the types of emotions that insects could elicit. Salvador Dali and Schiaparelli were collaborators, were known for their famous skeleton dress and this lobster dress. This has a crazy story behind it because apparently Wallis Simpson, who was an American socialite who caused Prince Edward to abdicate the throne, she wore this in a Vogue fashion shoot, and apparently the placement of the lobster is illustrated by Salvador Dali is supposed to be suggestive, so it was quite the scandal. Alexander McQueen is a much more contemporary fashion designer. He also was known to push boundaries with his work, lots of amazing stage work, and lots of nods to fashion designers of the past. So here you can kind of see one of his skeleton corsets next to the skeleton dress. And he was fascinated by this idea of Schiaparelli's story. And he often felt like he was a fashion outsider. He had kind of crooked teeth, and he was a little bit pudgy and didn't really fit the mold of what the fashion industry would normally look at. And he kind of grew up in a poor family, and he loved the idea of the garden around the face. And he used this in some of his fashion design shows, but of course, using insects and butterflies. This is one of his first exhibits where he sent models down with live insects. There's butterflies flying around inside of this encasement. But one of my favorite shows that he did was Voss. And at the end of the show, so this whole time these models have been walking around this mysterious black box in the center of the stage. And as the last model walks off the runway, The lights dim, heavy breathing is emanating from the PA system, and a single light begins to glow in the center of this black box. And with that, the sides begin to open. It's very dramatic. And release hundreds of moths and butterflies as the sides shatter on the ground. A very dramatic scene. In the center, you see a Rubenesque woman covered in moths. The model that was in the end, Michelle Ollie, said that my body is going to be at odds with the sparrows and the bony old crow people in the audience. I am what most of them fear most, that. So McQueen really liked to push the edge in terms of what we consider to be beautiful and what those standards are, because they're often unrealistic. Just because I had to include this, he did a art installation with Nick Knight that involved doing by number with, I think, over 80 gallons of dyed nuggets. Apparently you dye them for fishing purposes. And the paint by number was a beautiful portrait of a woman. And you would actually see this by walking into the church, and it was reflected on a mirror above. You can kind of see it here. And apparently as you walked up to it, you didn't know what it was until you were right next to it. So again, this idea of taking something ugly and turning it into something beautiful. After McQueen's sad death in 2010, Sarah Burton kind of took up the helm. Well, actually, this is still his work here, one of his last shows, Plato's Closets. Lots of insect nods to insects and digital photography. Here's some of Sarah Burton's Alexander McQueen, embroidered beetles. This is actually the embodiment of an entire Goliath beetle. And here's some butterflies. This should actually look kind of familiar if you've seen the Hunger Games movie. This dress was featured. All right. So one more piece. Why would I feature Cruella de Vil? Well, it turns out that her character in this rendition of Disney was actually based on McQueen. They looked to him as kind of an edgy punk rock, pushing boundaries. If you put some of her outfits next to his looks, it's pretty easy to see some of the comparisons there. But the center dress here is from the movie, and the dresses on the side are some of McQueen's pieces. But this is the dress that, if you haven't seen the movie yet, it's been out for a long time, so don't feel too bad giving you some of the surprise of the movie away. But at one point, Cruella's character makes an entire dress using these beautiful gold butterfly chrysalises and sews them on piece by piece. But this is, and they lock away with this beautiful collection of dresses because they don't want the ideas to be stolen. They go and they unlock it. All of these moths come pouring out. And of course, they've eaten the entire collection, caused terror and panic. It's quite the scene in the movie. And if you remember back to this scene and compare it to the McQueen fashion show Voss, I think there's a lot of interesting parallels. And the whole idea is taking something of beauty, right? And also recognizing that there is a hint of tension there, and it makes it memorable. So here, I was thrilled to see this. This is a more recent Schiaparelli piece. And as you can see, there are clusters of ants, which I think this is a beautiful nod to Schiaparelli's work with Salvador Dali. And of course, I thought this was beautiful. But then when this was posted on Instagram, I, of course, had to immediately dive into the comments section. And comments like, what anxiety it gave me. I can't with this. Just why? And then, you know, the emojis of throwing up. Now, to be fair, there were several people who also thought it was amazing, like me. But this is what the designers are aiming for, right? They're aiming for something that grabs your attention and makes you feel something a bit deeper than just, hey, that's pretty. And so if you're interested in that story that I just told, I actually published a paper a couple years ago that kind of outlines all of these people and work together. And it's, if you just Google my name and insects as fashion muse and provocateur, super easy to find, free to download. And this is a recent Schiaparelli necklace from this year. And then just to compare it with Schiaparelli from 1938, I love it when fashion design houses nod to their past. All right, I know that was really fast, but I wanted to make sure that I had time then to turn and talk about some of my work and what I do. So I've been working with insects for a really long time. And a big thing for me is getting people to care, getting people to care about something that initially might seem frightening. And like I said, I do a lot of community engaged activities, but I found that actually wearing insects on my garments somehow, um, I don't know if it familiarized people with it or if it made them feel more comfortable. And I think I had something about Miss Frizzle early on. I do think there is that joyful and fun part about wearing your science. And I've noticed a lot of scientists doing this lately. But as you can see in all of these outreach events, I'm wearing some sort of garment that has insects on it. Well, of course, I couldn't always find the types of insects I wanted or the types of garments I wanted, or I wanted to replicate a garment that I couldn't afford because I'm a scientist, not a wealthy person. So I had to take matters into my own hands. And the beauty of this is I was able to take some of those talents that I learned growing up in a household and also learning new talents. So here's some lino cutting. I absolutely love lino cut stamping fabric. And this has been a real fun way to incorporate more insects into my wardrobe. The one in the upper left-hand corner here, I call that, it ends up being my pandemic jacket. I don't think I've got another image that's a bit closer up of it. But I worked on this in 2020, and it's a bunch of lino cut pieces, very much thinking Alexander McQueen style when I made it. But you're going to see what I did with those little green shells there in a minute. Tiger beetles, and of course, the trilobites are just so cool that I had to do a trilobite shirt. Embroidery. I do a lot of embroidery as well. And the one that you see kind of most predominantly featured there in the middle is me actually learning this mirror embroidery technique from India and taking buprested beetle wings and actually incorporating that onto the jacket that I was making. They're super light, and people often ask me like, well, how can you wash the jacket? I'm like, it's fine to wash by hand. Definitely wouldn't throw it in the washing machine. But I've washed it by hand a few times, and the elytra or the beetle wings are very resistant to water, so no problem there. And here's kind of the back up close of my jacket. I would like to do a few more of these. The Cecropia moth tends to be something that I go back to over and over again for obvious reasons. And I've done some of these more intricate beaded brooches. I think if I slow down, I could probably get even more detail. This is one that when I wear it, people are often like, ooh, I love your dragonfly. And I don't like being that person who stops and you start giving them a lecture. Well, actually, but if they're really interested, I talk about how this is a Dobson fly. And they're a really interesting indication of good water quality. They're a bit terrifying when you see them for the first time because they have these giant mandibles that come out the front of their heads. And so they're a little more intense and intimidating than your standard dragonfly. And this is a Polyphemus moth, something that we find commonly in our backyards here in the Midwest. I'm probably the second largest saturnid moth in North America. As you can see, I've got little sequins and beads, and they're not very neat and tidy, but I just keep going until it looks right to me. I've been thinking more in terms of like future direction with the garments that I make, about them telling a story. And since I am a teacher, a professor, I tend to think about how my garments can tell a story. So this coat, I actually printed these cicadas in Jennifer Angus's studio a few years ago, and I printed the fabric and had a few cicadas left over after I made myself a pair of pants, and I wanted to use them. And you can see on the two sides where I've got the garment open, it says 1803 and then 2024. This was to commemorate the double brood cicada emergence that we had in the Midwest a few years ago, and that 1803 is the last time a double emergence occurred, and then that double emergence occurred again in 2020. And I thought it was such a important kind of thing that happens so rarely that a garment to celebrate that would be a lot of fun. And recently, I have really gotten into knitting. I mean, I had knit for a long time, started out quite young, but I was knitting scarves or I was getting other people's patterns off of Ravelry. The moth mitts up there, the underwing moth mitt, pattern is actually not mine. I got that off of Ravelry, and it's a great pattern that you can find. But I wasn't quite. And then actually the center one on the bottom, that was the Coleoptera sweater. And that was also somebody else's design. But I decided that I wanted to explore my own types of designs. So I began knitting my own sweaters. And I think these two are probably the two that I'm most proud of or interested in. And of course, I incorporated quotes from some of my famous, my favorite scientists. E.O. Wilson is kind of a famous entomologist who passed away just a few years ago. I grew up reading his work. The little things that run the world was kind of his famous quote, and kind of pointed to how important insects are in terms of running ecosystems. And then the other one is actually a quote from Darwin, and it says, "From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved." And this jacket, actually, I don't have a picture of the front, but it has all of the major phyla that we cover as part of my introduction to biology class. So there is an insect for arthropods on the front. I've got my, my squid and my water bears and planaria worms, and there's mushrooms, and there's all sorts of plants represented. And so, yeah, it was a lot to squeeze in all of that diversity on a single coat, but it's one of my favorite things in my wardrobe. I've been doing other designs more recently. My focus is often on beetles. The video here is actually showing a bracelet that I own that has the actual beetle encased inside of it. I think Jennifer Angus often uses this type of beetle as well in her exhibits. And now it's a completed vest with these weevils. And then, of course, I had to start using tiger beetles in some of my pieces as well. I was talking to an artist friend of mine the other day about what this particular crowd of people would like to see in a talk. And she actually talked about how people might be interested in what my process looks like. And so just to give you a general idea of like, where do I get my ideas and how do I kind of go about thinking about some of my projects and actually kind of future directions, because I'm early on in this. I think that for so long, a part of who I am has always been I do art as a hobby. I'm not really an artist. I'm not really an artist. And I think a lot of people who don't go to college for art and get a proper degree in art have a hard time, or aren't making money as an artist, have a hard time calling themselves an artist. And it's only been in the last few years that I feel more comfortable with that sort of title, even though people have been telling me forever I was an artist. But anyway, so just giving you an idea of like, how am I incorporating these things? Last year, I went to the 80th North Central Branch meeting, happened to be in Lincoln, Nebraska. For my PhD, I worked on something called the Salt Creek tiger beetle. And it's one of the most endangered insects in the world. I think there's only about 600 left in the wild. Unfortunately, they live in a habitat that is just north of Lincoln, which is an very much expanding urban development issue. So there's a lot of scientists working hard to try and save this tiger beetle. And I just got to be there kind of in the middle of it for a while to help. But they asked me to come back and help co-present a symposia about like, what did the research say? Where's the direction of the research going now? And also they were interested in how do we talk to the public and convey the importance of this beetle that's actually, as far as beetles go, it's not the most beautiful one. It's kind of a mud brown. I think it's gorgeous, but it's gorgeous in a more subtle way than those bright green buprestids. So we actually had a nice little art exhibit that went along with it. Several artists had pieces in it. And as part of this, I decided, and this was about 6 months ahead, I knew I was going to be doing this. I wanted to make a piece for the exhibit. So where do I start? So I have these notebooks that I carry with me all the time. And I always laugh because they've got my grocery list for the week. They've got my to-do list, but they also have lots of crazy drawings and me trying to figure out what I'm working on. So those of you, I always used to struggle because I always thought I used to have this sketchbook that had these beautiful drawings in it. And I never had it with me when I wanted to. So now I just keep the same book with me all the time and I write everything in it. And this was like, first concept, nice big tiger beetle. Maybe I'll have some other insects. But then I was like, I think it would be more fun to have almost like, I kept thinking of like MC Escher, and I looked at tiles and how they were locking in together. And for those of you wondering about how I design, I know that there's software out there. I have a few people who keep telling me to buy the software because I'm driving myself crazy using essentially graph paper. I actually go on to something called printablepaper.net, and they have, so a knitted stitch is not quite square. So you can tell these are little rectangles. And then I just print that off. And honestly, it's just like turning the bug into a bunch of pixels. And I spend time and then I knit a swatch and make sure it looks right. And then it's knitting. And I know this looks terrible, but I want you to know this is tiger math. It's me figuring out how many stitches, having to measure how many stitches equal an inch. So a bit of time and attention going into the planning of it. And then this was the finished garment, and it's called Fading from the Landscape. And I really wanted to have that perception of these beetles kind of fading into the background to kind of as a nod to their disappearance. A piece that I'm currently working on, and I don't have much more than concept sketches. I was working on it last night a little bit. Is again, this year, the North Central Branch meeting is featuring a butterfly that is not doing well in terms of its population across the Midwest. It's called the regal flitterary. I know a lot of people see this and think it's a monarch, but it's another type of butterfly species. And I thought it would be interesting to do a piece with a play of that orange forewing and then the darker hindwing. And so right now I'm concept sketch, and you can see those little flowers on the collar. I'm kind of playing with this idea of companion pieces that would be embroidered. That would be its host plant, which is the prairie violet. But this is as far as I am right now. I know it's not easy to see, but I'm, playing with that striping and how this would look eventually. So kind of thinking about greater impacts, it's been really fun posting all of this on social media, meeting other people who have interests. And one thing I would say is entomologists are among the most artistic, maybe this isn't fair, but I think they're among the most artistic scientific group out there. I've met so many entomologists who have amazing talents in the arts, and a lot of them really love knitting. So in 2024, and also here in a month, we are hosting knitting circles at this scientific conference. And it has been a joy to meet other people who are interested in this. And then also, I think it really helps to kind of have like almost a cross-generational impact. We have people my age that are knitting entomologists, but we also have a lot of grad students, and it helps kind of break down the barriers that there are sometimes between different classes of like, oh, you're a professional and you're kind of scary to talk to versus, kind of the younger people that are entering the career field. And it gives an opportunity for mentorship and breaking down those barriers. Another great part of this is if you're into knitting and you like what I'm showing you, you should definitely check out Meredith Wilmot. She is a amazing knitting entomologist, and she actually has a Instagram called The Leaf Hopper, and she has a Ravelry, and she actually sells her patterns. And I think it's helped to subsidize the low wage of graduate school. But anyway, here you can see her ant cardigan, and those are actually leaf hoppers around the yoke of her cowl here. So really inspiring to work with her. And we're actually just submitted the final edits to a publication that talks about how knitting and entomology and outreach all go together so well. And really the ultimate, I would say, lesson of this paper is take whatever drives you and whatever you're passionate about and mix it with your science, and people can't help but be engaged in what you're doing. All right. So taking inspiration from everywhere I can, I would say that my chance to have met Jennifer Angus and go to her exhibits, I love how that Weevil vest ended up actually almost coordinating with this exhibit she had up in Wisconsin. The video on the side just showed you a piece that I actually got to print the fabric in her studio and then make a wearable garment for myself. So I love it when my pieces have stories about who I've interacted with and who I've collaborated with. Recently, I've collaborated with Wendy DeShane and Jeff Schmucke, Auburn University, and we actually installed this amazing mural at Augustana College that celebrates beetles. And this is another thing that just by getting to know artists and talking about our joint interest in entomology and interest in conveying the importance of insects, I've had a lot of great opportunities to collaborate. And really, as artists, you know that you know how to communicate. And I think that scientists can really benefit from learning from you and learning how to engage people's emotions. As scientists, we're always told, keep emotion out of it. That's true. But if you want funding, if you want people to care, learning how to kind of key into that is so important. So some future projects, if you're just kind of curious, where am I going with this? I have a plan for a whole series of an endangered vest series. I think the vests are nice because they kind of hang like tapestries when they're finished. I don't have to worry about those sleeves. This is an American burying beetle vest that I'm working on, and I somehow want to incorporate a dead bird because they think that somehow the disappearance of the passenger pigeon in 1914 is connected to why there declines, because they rely on burying dead birds about that size. So they think they might be connected. I want to fuse more science and data with the art because I think the idea of incorporating data into textiles is interesting. I've seen some different groups that are doing that. I'm working right now on a review article on insects in fashion and more of a robust historical deep dive. And right now, I'm also working on taking insect products and infusing them into a project. So this is a vest that will be made from silk, knitted with silk, dyed with cochineal, and maybe some incorporation of buprested wings. And then I want to incorporate the actual life cycle of those insects into the design itself. So lots of future plans, not always a lot of time, but it's the sort of thing that keeps me going. And with that, I'd like to just encourage everybody here, pursue your passions, whatever you love, explore that. And I think it can lead you into really amazing directions in your life. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my presentation. And let's see here. Hopefully you can see my face still. And I would love to take questions. I would say, like, here's my notebook. I've always got one on hand right next to me to write down ideas. But yeah, so would love to answer questions or have a conversation.
Thank you so much. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute or you can type them in the chat. I'll give everybody a second. I have a few questions of my own that I want to ask, but I'll, let some other people ask their questions first if they have any. All right. So we've got one. Oh, it was just somebody thanking you for your education and your craft.
Thank you.
Speaking of your education and craft, one of the questions that I had that I was curious about is what do you feel is your biggest challenge in your practice? I know you've talked a lot about the duality of your background where, you are formally educated on the science portion of your practice, but then also kind of self-taught in your art making. Yeah, I'm curious, what is the biggest challenge that you feel you face?
Well, I mean, I think like everybody, it's time. I'm a mom of two teenagers and, like all those things. But besides that, I think it's first giving myself permission to call myself an artist and feel comfortable with that role. But also sometimes one thing I've been thinking about a lot working with artists, it is as a scientist, it's there is a truth to what the data is telling me, and I have to stick within that. But then sometimes art, you know what I mean? Art doesn't necessarily adhere to that strict following of protocol. So I think it makes me a better scientist, but also a better artist at the same time to get to go down both those paths. But one thing when I work with artists, I always have to be making sure that the story we're telling is accurate and clear. And that's why I think working with artists has been so good, because they rely on me to make sure that they're not overstepping or overstating. But yeah, sometimes I always feel like I have to be like a buzzkill, right? Because I'm like, oh, I'm sorry, that's not really what the data says, But I think that it makes for a good partnership, though.
Awesome. I have a question here from the chat. Cynthia had mentioned, I absolutely love your art. Do you want to explore making garments that use sewing more? Is their question.
I do quite a bit of sewing, but I always feel like I'm a bit of an amateur. I know how to make like 3 or 4 garments, and I think I just keep going back to those 4 patterns. I have a pant pattern that I'm pretty good at, and a jacket, and I reuse that once in a while. And that was kind of the beauty of going up and seeing Jennifer Angus and being able to print fabric, and that kind of encourages me to do a bit more sewing. Right now I'm in a knitting fix, but I think I've got some sewing ideas coming up. I see the question about socials. Find me at Dr. Beetle on Instagram. So you can either just look up my name, Tierney Brosius, and I think I pop up. I think I'm the only Tierney Brosius in the world. And then at Dr. Beetle would be my thing. And please follow me. You can always see it's a combination of thrifted, found stuff online that I have collected off of eBay, and then also things that I make. I'm wearing some beaded beetles today, of course. I wanted something you could all see, but it's fun. It's
Another thing that I was curious about is, so it seems that, from your presentation earlier, you were speaking about how it seems to be that a common reaction from people is anxiety or discomfort when it
mm-hmm.
comes to insects. And it's something that we've kind of seen here firsthand in our exhibition, right? A lot
Yeah.
of students will either absolutely love it and be so interested and really dig deep into the exhibition. Other people are a little bit more tame and maybe are like, ooh, like, I don't know, that grasshopper makes me a little uncomfortable, that beetle makes me a little uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Um, I'm curious. So after whenever you're giving presentations or you're sharing your art with communities, do you feel that people walk away with a better understanding and maybe not as much anxiety or misunderstanding about insects?
I do think so. And I think that really, I've always said that this is a great analogy to life, right? And I think that maybe this is a good lesson everyone in the world should listen to right now. And that's when you know more about something and you learn more about something, you're less afraid of it. Like education results in less fear. And I think that by providing spaces and one thing, wearing insects and doing things like that, it's like an impromptu like lesson. I could be at the grocery store and someone's like, oh, bugs on your shirt, and I can be like, yeah, and I can have this like little mini science lesson, and I think that person walks away with you know an appreciation of insects. And I think the thing that I love about insects is I think of that duality. I think their fear draws people in. I mean, there's a lot of psychology that says there's a reason why we like scary movies and we go to you know scary haunted houses this time of the year, and we scare ourselves intentionally all the time, and it's because we kind of get a thrill out of it. And I think insects provide that. Well, at the same time, they're absolutely gorgeous, right? You just take a little extra second, and even something like a mosquito under a microscope, and you look at the little iridescent scales on their wings up close, it's magical. But of course, they're also like the leading cause of death in the world because they transmit malaria and all sorts of things. So there's this duality to them. And I think that it's the starter for so many interesting conversations. And I don't know a single entomologist that can't take over a dinner party with wild stories about what insects do, right? Like, I love that when we go places and my husband's like, we introduce ourselves and we'll be like, oh, what do you do? And he's like, I'm a data analyst. And they're like, uh-huh. And then I'm like, I'm an entomologist. Boom, like immediately the coolest person in the world. And if you're a kid under the age of like 8, and then at the same time, like people have questions. I once saw this bug. Tell me what it was. So insects have this draw that I think inspires so many people, including myself.
I've got one more question for you, a little bit more of a fun one. Is there any
Yeah.
insect that maybe you haven't had the opportunity to research or explore more that, maybe
Mm-hmm.
its geography has posed a challenge, financial, whatever it may be? Yeah, I'm curious if there's one that you would really
Yeah.
love to research a little more.
That's a good question. I mean, honestly, that whole thing that I'm doing up in Yellowstone, we want to go back because, so those tiger beetles I study, they're larvae. So they start out as a larva, kind of like a butterfly starts at a caterpillar, and they live in the ground and they sit and wait until something walks by and they just kind of like grab it and pull it into their hole. So they don't have to expend much energy. It's a good strategy. The crazy thing is that there's these thermal crusts in Yellowstone and essentially scalding hot water under here, and then about 6 to 7 inches of earth. And the tiger beetles are living in that. These larval tiger beetles are in that. And we're like, are they like, what are they doing? Like, are they living there all year round? Can they be active in the winter because they've got their own little microclimate of heat? Yeah, I want to know what's going on with those guys really badly. And that is kind of like some of the plan. But obviously, working in Yellowstone is a ton of like permits and worrying about bears and also worrying about falling through thermal crust. That and then in the art side of things, I want to start doing more with insects people don't like. So I would say something like earwigs really freak people out. and they're so cool, and they have the most beautiful wings, and they're completely harmless. They're called the name is actually something that's just unfortunate. They don't crawl in people's ears, but I think someone told me in Scotland they call them forky tails, and I want to start calling them that here because it's much cuter than earwig, I think. So, oh, that's
Uh,
really, I just saw the Allie Ward ologies. Oh
yeah.
man, I would love that. She is like one of my favorites.
All right. Well, anybody have any final questions? If not, we will thank you for your time and thank you for your
Yeah.
presentation. It was really
Well, and I would
wonderful and
say
insightful.
if anybody has any questions or they want to reach out with anything that they saw or any like, hey, I saw this cool bug once. I love those questions. Just message me on Instagram. I'll see it.